All right, so thanks for joining me, Alec. What made you get involved in production design for film and TV, and was it always something you were interested in?
No, it wasn't. Not at all. The way I ended up in film is sort of, I think, like a lot of people in film, truthfully, it's a little bit circuitous. Um, I went to college thinking that I was going to be a natural science or pre-med type of person, biology. I'd worked in gene splicing lab in high
Really?
school. I did theater in high school, but mostly a little bit of acting, a little bit of directing, a little bit of set building. I grew up in a small town in Eastern Washington, a college town, and film was not a thing that was a thing. You went to movies, you saw movies. I loved movies, but it wasn't a thing that you could actually do. There was literally zero. If you wanted to go into whatever sports broadcasting, lug a camera around at Pac-12 football games, sure. But other than that, it wasn't actually a thing. Um, but that said, I'd seen a lot of films. I loved old monster movies. I loved westerns. My dad drugged me to Kubrick stuff that came through the college. So I had a decent background in terms of understanding what movies are, but really it didn't start. And I'm kind of stubborn. And when I got to college, they loved my college. But we had an enormous number of people in our freshman class who wanted to be pre-med. And I was more interested in maybe I was going to be a doctor, maybe I was just going to be a scientist. And I'd already had 2 years of chem, and I was tired of it, and I wanted to get back to taking biology. My high school only had one biology class total, so I'd taken it 3 years earlier, and I wanted to take bio again. Um, and we had so many for a small college. I went to Amherst College, and we had so many people in my class who were like, "No, we're all going to be doctors," and they were smart enough to realize that that wasn't going to happen. They knew they'd admitted it wasn't going to be a thing. It's not a STEM school. It's a perfectly great science school for humanity science sort of ideas, but not. And so they made everybody take chemistry, knowing that of the number of people who wanted to go into sciences, the number of people who could actually handle that course load was not the same. And I'm a stubborn ass, and I said no. I said, "Fuck that! I'm not doing it. I'll do something else. I'll take bio in the spring. I'll still have plenty of time to figure out what I want to do." And I took an art class. I'd never taken an art class before ever. Um, and but I can't. I went to college to get a liberal arts education. I went to college to figure out what the world was, what my place in it was, the ideas that surround it, and I kind of fell in love with the art part. Um, I also was, not naive enough to know that you don't will wake up at 18 years old and all of a sudden after one class say, "Hey, I'm an artist, a visual artist." Um, but I was kind of hooked. And so what I ended up doing in college is a lot of different stuff, but I ended up migrating to theater design. And so by when I took a lot of art classes. I took a lot of theater classes. I did some acting and directing. I did some movement stuff. I did poli sci and psych and history and English and all the things that you actually kind of need ultimately to be a good designer. Not thinking that I was doing vocational education at all, just I was interested in a lot of different stuff. And by the time I graduated, I was trying to decide whether I wanted to go to grad school in theater design or possibly take a little bit more time before going to grad school and get a fine art MBA or MFA. And I decided to do a theater grad degree. And so what I did is I worked for a year. I got a fellowship to stay on, design a bunch of plays, both sets and costumes. At that point, I was drawing and sculpting and doing painting and doing a lot of stuff all the time. Um, and I That year was great. That year sort of told me for myself that I really wanted. I was interested in design. I was interested in how the visual world that we surround production with and surround performance with interacts with the text, interacts with what a play is trying to do. Still no thought of film, none at all. I got into Yale Drama School as a set and costume designer, and I did. After a year after undergrad, I went to Yale, did the MFA program, and then I came out, and my wife, who at that point we were been together for quite a while at the end of that, and she was a director and an administrator and a stage manager. She was working at Hartford Stage. I was in New Haven, and we lived halfway in between. So she sort of commuted north, and I commuted south. And she wanted to sort of give film a try. Um, and my extended family's from California. I didn't grow up there, and I was like, sure, I'll move out to LA. Because at that point I got very lucky. Um, I was ready to do it, but I also was very lucky at the end of grad school, and I got 5 or 6 professional gigs right out of grad school
Wow.
as a designer, and in theater. So I was like, I can work anywhere because none of them were anywhere. 2 were in New York, one was in North Carolina, one was in Indianapolis, one was in Boise, um, in Idaho. And so we moved out to LA, and that year was great. But I was never home. And it's the grand irony of my professional career where I basically started doing film to be home, because we were just about to get married, and I was never there. So I literally lived with her grandmother more the year after I graduated graduate school than I lived with her. Her grandmother was 87 years old, living in an apartment in New York City and had a spare room. So I literally that was my home base. And our apartment was in LA. So it's a very long version of the story, but
No, you're good.
so after that year, I started looking for film. It was something that I knew I wanted to do, or I was interested in trying, partially because when I was working at Williamstown Theater Festival with Amy in the late 80s, early 90s, I guess, 91 and 93, we worked there, or something like that, 92 and 95. One of the things that I did is it was a wonderful place to learn. Best designers in the world come through there. You get to, as a real young professional, you get to work with them and assist them. Hugh Landwehr, John Conklin, Jess Goldstein, just tons of really big name theater designers. Ann Roth was there once. And you get to work with great actors. Christopher Walken, Blythe Danner, Gwyneth when she was a bratty child. Lots and lots and lots of James Naughton, hundreds of really brilliant actors and writers and directors. And you get to sort of figure out what professional theater is like. And you also have no air conditioning in the Berkshires in the summer, and you're living in these crappy little dorms that they don't turn on the heat because they're cheap as shit. And so whenever you get a day off, which is once every 2 weeks, everybody piles over in the mall and buys tickets for movies and sits in blessed air conditioning for, like, Amy and I would do 3 movies straight. So there was one of those weekends where we saw The Unforgiven, and that was the first movie that it was the first movie that I recognized in myself how the design made that movie. And Henry Bumstead, who's one of the all-time great production designers, designed it. And he did something in that movie that is really spectacular. And that movie did something that was really spectacular, where it did something that is very tricky. It's 3 different movies at the same time. It's a Western story. That in some ways, then, it's a twist on the Western story. It's a twist on ideas of masculinity. It's a twist on what violence does to men primarily, and the fact that women are often the unwilling recipients of that violence. But it's also about what being a violent man does to a person. And so it works on those levels of sort of classical theater and classical film ideas. Also, it is absolutely a eulogy for the Cold War. It is playing around and investigating the idea of, what do we do when we're a society that has defined ourselves as one based on violence and has to remake ourselves? It's Moon, the Eastwood character, who is really probably the only person in the world who could do that because he was that guy. I mean, his career is from all the way back, A Few Dollars More, The Man with No Name, all the way through Outlaw Josie Wales. He's played around with that, and even in his Dirty Harry shit, he plays around with ideas of what violence does to people and to men, and the idea of sort of living up to those ideas and then coming back. And he decided, I think, maybe unconsciously, to do one that talked about what, as a country, that means. And, is it swords into plowshares? It's the end of the Cold War. And really, that movie is a eulogy for the Cold War. And it's what do we do afterwards? And so fresh from being sort of immersed into Bertolt Brecht and Chekhov and all of these amazing writers through history, I go and sit down in the movie theater basically to get into the air conditioning. And I'm like, this movie is doing many of the same things that those kinds of plays are doing. It's asking questions, and the visual environment that wraps around it is integral to what that movie is. And I thought to myself, I could do this. I know what this movie is doing in a way that is deeper than, hey, I made some good sets, or I'm never going to be able to design a whole entire block in New York. I know what the film is actually doing at heart. And in some ways, and I kind of got hooked on that. And I was like, I really want to try this. I want to see what that relationship is like. Now, there is a huge difference between, I mean, I think in some ways I'm still a theater designer in terms of how I approach stuff who works in film, because I think I approach texts and projects the same way that I did in theater. That is an interesting, there's an interesting difference because in theater, you work in metaphor completely. No one really truly forgets they're sitting in a theater with 700 people and they're watching something that is a metaphor for what they're supposed to be seeing. Nothing is ever, very rarely is it ever photoreal. And if it is photoreal in the theater, that is its own kind of metaphor. In film, that abstraction from a metaphorical thinking about what is in front of you to a literal thinking about what is real has been done for you. It's done by the camera, it's done by the design, it's done by the director picking the angles to shoot, and it is turned into celluloid or pixels or whatever, and it's projected onto a two-dimensional screen that gives you the illusion of three dimensions. That metaphorical translation has been done for you. And so when you step into a movie theater, with very, very few exceptions, you accept what is on that screen as a version of reality, as one version of real. Whatever the rules are that are defined within that flat screen, those are the rules generally through the whole project. I have a tendency to like projects where that relationship is complicated or problematic, more than I like projects. No, that's not true. Cinema does a lot of different things. That's one of the things I really like in cinema, is when we play around with those ideas. When we play around with Southland Tales and Red are two films that I've done that play around with ideas of tone and what is real and the genre ways that we approach what we're actually looking at, and that have one of them, it's psychotic, Southland Tales, in terms of the way that Richard flips between genre and idea and tone and the way things are being, and very consciously, the way that they are being presented. Red, less so, and it's more linear, but it does change. The tone of that film and the kinds of things that we were doing in that film have changed from the beginning to the end completely. And it becomes a different movie and it becomes a different tone. It's not even a comedy for a long time. And then it obviously is. So that kind of got me to the place where I thought, hey, I'd like to try to design film. Or at that point it was film, it wasn't TV, but then, industries change. Now it's both. When that happened, I kept doing theater, but I also looked for film work. I was an art director for little tiny, tiny movies in Los Angeles, less than $1 million. $250,000 films, $500,000 films, never anything like $30,000, make it on your friend's credit card, but, little movies. Those in some ways are really great because the stakes aren't high. You're not having to be a manager of lots and lots of people. You do not need the knowledge of how you and your department integrates into the overall sort of budget structure and schedule structure. They give you a schedule, you're going to make it. You kind of got to go do the work, but it allows you to learn how the machine works. Um, and then very quickly, because it turned out I was good at that, and partially that's all from theater. You have to figure out how to do something. I started designing little teeny movies. And so what happened very quickly is because I'd gone to graduate school and because I was already a theater designer, I could say, hey, here's my design work. Here's my design ideas. Here are things that I've actually conceived, drawn, sketched, built models for, and built based on the ideas in the script and working with directors. Hire me. And people did. And then what ended up happening is I had two careers for about 10 years. I was an art director and of progressively bigger and bigger films. And I was a production designer on smaller movies that more slowly got bigger. So I did, some of them were good. Let the Devil Wear Black is a fine little film. Stacey Title directed. It's basically Hamlet. It's a contemporary language version of Hamlet that she wrote with her husband who acts in it. It's a good little movie. So I designed some things that actually, and the cast is spectacular. And then I got a couple of references to design for a couple of British designers who came over. I did K-Pax probably well earlier than I should really have gotten a job of that scope. But you know what? I didn't fuck it up, and it turned out well. So I ended up getting bigger and bigger films. And from that, the decorator of that, which I pushed to hire, was one of my all-time favorite decorators in the world. Just from the work she'd done, Cheryl Karasik recommended me to her designer, who she normally works with, Bo Welsh. And then I ended up with, one of the great designers in history as a mentor. And I art directed for him a number of times. So I ended up with a whole lot of luck and probably my semi unhealthy, insane work ethic did not hurt. To kind of get the next job and the next job and the next job. And I got to do some good small films. I got hired from sight unseen with a phone call, and really because I knew how to read a script for The Contender. And that, you puts you in a different realm. It gets picked up by DreamWorks. It's Joan Allen and Jeff Bridges and Sam Elliott, an amazing cast, great script. And I got that movie because I could read, not because I could design. I got that movie because I read the script and I went into the interview and it had a designer for one day. That didn't work out. So the person hadn't designed anything, but they got let go. And the director was looking for somebody new, and I read the script, broke the script down, thought about it, and had one phone call where I said, your script is about sacrifice. Everything about that movie is about sacrifice. And it's about our politicians being willing to do self-sacrifice for the good of the whole. And I said, every storyline revolves around that. And he was like, great, when do you want to start? I mean, basically, I understood that film. I understood what it needed. And I talked about how you design that. And what parts of the script went toward that and why they were important. And he, even though he hadn't seen much of my design work, maybe we sent him a couple of photos. He basically said, I feel like I'm in good hands in terms of the visual world of this because you understand what this film needs. And then, that The Contender led to other things. It led to Darko partially, which led to everything else, really. Donnie Darko was one of those films that just never happened. I mean, I can't say it's anything other than, a certain amount of luck on my part in getting the job. Richard is a fucking prophet. The stuff that he writes comes true. I wish we were in a time where people were willing to take risks to make more of his films. It's a fucking tragedy on some level that he's only made 3. I've worked on a couple others that never actually happened. And other designers have worked on more than that even than I have. Some of my art directors, Priscilla Elliott, has worked on a couple also. I mean, they're great. Dr. Destruction, he wrote one about an amniotronic cow named Bessie.
I've read that
Um,
one. I read part of that one. I actually I did
yeah.
like a video about all of his unmade projects I could find. Each one of them was like crazier than the last.
Did you? He has a really, really brilliant film on the guy who created The Twilight Zone.
Yeah, I was only able to find like synopsises for them, but the stuff I found was really cool. Like there was one of his like Holes script that he wrote that was super
Yep.
crazy. He wrote a Cat's Cradle script too. I saw that. Like it got crazy. And then I saw he's actually releasing a book this year, apparently,
Oh, good.
based on
I'm
one of
really
his
glad.
ideas. And he was talking about being very crazy and ambitious, just everything you would want from one of his movies.
They always are. They're they I he's got an amazingly fluid mind. He he's incredibly smart, but also he's really artistically nimble. Um, it's very interesting looking at the three films that we did, that I designed for him. Darko, nothing changed. It is the only time that has ever happened to me in my whole life. The script that I read, the script that I interviewed, and the script that we made were exactly the same. Nothing changed. No, you know what? That's not true. The Sharita Chen character was originally named Sharita Chowdhury and was Indian American instead of Asian American. That is the only change in that film, I think, that I can even remember. We had it was brilliant when I read it. He did an amazingly amazing job with it, and in some ways, I'm not sure why he hired me. I mean, he had the really good sense to hire. Um, I think he probably needed somebody like me. He had Stephen Poster and he had April Ferry. And if you're talking about two people with just one of a totally different generation than me, April, rest in peace, is no longer with us. But she died in her 90s. I don't know, 8 years ago or so. Um, and Stephen's still alive, but he's old at this point. He's in his probably late 80s at this point. But they were both they'd had full careers. They had absolutely full careers. Um, then he had an editor and a production designer who, we were kids basically. I mean, I wasn't a kid like Richard was. I didn't think he was 25, but or he was just 25. Um, and Sam was his editor, and Sam had done, I think, some of his short film, and so he was basically of his generation. I was just a little bit older. I was probably 29 or 30. um, you know Richard was in middle school at the time that he writes about. I was in high school. And so, but one of the things that I said when I talked to him about that script initially was, this is a period movie. We're making it in 2000, but it's about the 80s, and the 80s was a very specific time. The whole ideas of creating these programmatic things, to being really worried about what children are doing, what teenagers are becoming, the parental guidance stickers on music, the idea that a different kind of worry than the 60s, but basically this sort of backlash of 1950s Puritanism in the United States in terms of what's happening with young people, and being incredibly worried about that, not having not understanding how to talk to children, to talk to young adults, to being able to see where they sit in the world. And it's got Reagan, it's got Ronald Reagan hovering all over that film in a lot of ways, not in good ways. And it was very interesting seeing somebody's take who was slightly younger than me of that same time period, but I also knew it. I knew what he was talking about in that, and I basically could say I'd lived that in a way that worked really well. And then we just made it. It ended up being, I'd had enough experience doing small independent films in Los Angeles, that I sort of knew where to go to look for the high school, and to find people who, I did some of it myself. I had done enough larger films that I had resources to find a place to get the mongrel sculpture sculpted. I drew it myself and then had somebody else do it. I knew enough small set designers, or enough good set designers, who I could bring somebody in for a couple of weeks to do some drafting for me, so I didn't have to do it all myself. Um, and and then it also was just a lot of legwork. We found an area in in Long Beach, Country Club Drive area that looks like the East Coast. It's one of the only places in Los Angeles that actually looks like the East Coast. It looks like Virginia. Um, and we were, without saying it's Virginia, it's Richmond. It's where Richard grew up. So it didn't have to be actually Richmond, but that was the basic idea of what we were trying to do. It's not a West Coast story. Um, so and then some of it was also just figuring out how to do for no money at all. Which stuff I really, really, really wanted to push for to build as scenery, and to make sense to build the scenery, and then which stuff we had to do on location. Donnie's bedroom, both before and after, our stage build. The Catherine Ross office where Donnie's going to therapy, stage build. A bathroom where he stabs the mirror, stage build. The room that he burns down, of Patrick Swayze's house, stage build. And then all the rest of their house. The kitchen, we built out a back porch into a kitchen because that one big dinner scene, or a couple big dinner scenes that are in the kitchen, there we couldn't find a kitchen that was big enough. And I sort of pushed as it was a remodel that they'd done in their house, and it created a different traffic pattern through the house. And in some ways, the feeling of what you do as a designer, what it looks like, how it works, a lot of it also revolves around how can you actually film it. You're making a machine for movies. You're looking at, when Donnie is led through that house. 25 years, I still remember this film actually quite well in terms of the making it. But being led through the house, you needed a route. And so in some ways, one of the things that we did for that route is we opened up the ground plan of a very traditional 1930s or 40s house in Long Beach, and we opened it up to the path that he would follow and take through. And so looking at that stuff with Richard, everything above the staircase going down with the chandelier that swings when the airplane engine hits the house and Maggie's at the bottom of it, that everything but the chandelier, which we added, was there. Everything on top of that staircase was a stage build on the second floor. So we sort of figured out how to break it up and how to build a couple little things, even though we didn't have a lot of money, and then how to make something else work for what was in the script. And that film in a lot of ways was driven by these ideas for long shots that Richard had. The long shot, the school shot, the
Cool.
gigantic oneer, which is actually three shots tied together, but coming out of the school bus to in the door, down the hallway, Seth Rogen as a meathead. Amazing also casting. Richard is amazing in terms of both his sense of who is really going to be good for things, but also what he's then writing about the future. I mean, Southland Tales is today, for Christ's sake.
I saw a
You make
quote of
good.
him. I saw a quote of him saying that he likes choosing actors that he thinks were like pigeonholed into different roles. And so like I think Southland Tales, the three leads, I actually think it's probably some of the best work each of them has done. Like I love like the hand thing The Rock does, and it's so good.
Yeah. It The Southland Tales is the fact that not more people have seen it is a tragedy, I think.
Yeah.
I love that movie. I mean, I'll finish up Darko and then I'll segue into Southland Tales. You had mentioned that you were interested in knowing about the airplane engine. So the
Yeah.
airplane engine was an interesting problem because when you start doing research into them, you realize that they weigh tons and tons and tons. And an airplane engine, basically of the correct size, well, and also if it had hit a house, the house would just be gone. But we're going to suspend disbelief in that because there's something else happening there in general, based on what the script is. And so it's not a completely naturalistic thing, but you have an airplane engine that plummets from the plane, goes through a house, and we had to both find something that you could really pick up and that somebody would let us buy. An airplane engine of that size weighs about 35,000 pounds. You can't pick that up. I mean, you can't put that on a truck. It's impossible. They transport them. They transport a lot of those things actually attached to airplanes. They're hard to move. They get broken if you set them down on their side. And what I found out was that I actually looked at it, I figured out how they were built, and I realized I don't need the engine. The engine is actually just the interior part. What I need is the cowling. Um, and but they're complicated and they don't look right if they're not right. We're going to be close to this thing. And so when I was trying to figure out how to do it, I was like, we need to go to, there's an airplane graveyard in Arizona. Airplanes are notoriously difficult to store because if there's any moisture, you're fucked. They rot, they get mold, they get
Rust.
mildew. So the only place that they actually really keep them when they're kind of mothballed is there's a big graveyard in Arizona that almost never has any humidity, and the Mojave Desert in California. Um, the ones in Mojave, where I've actually filmed, I've done a bunch of airplane films. I did flight planning nonstop, and I've been up there a lot to sort of look at it, but they don't sell them off piecemeal there. In Arizona, they generally take them, they park them there, and they park them out. So we went down. We actually sent Mark Kelly, no relationship to Richard, but who was doing props on that, down there to photograph the shit. Oh no, he was our PA. On that, he's a great prop master in his own right now. But we sent him down there to find out if we could buy a cowling. Gave him dimensions, figured out the whole thing. He spent a couple of days measuring, sending photos back. Um, and one of the things that was very interesting about that is we then needed to figure out how the hell to build it. Because I could get the aluminum pieces that made up the most of it. But I needed some way to actually build the thing into an engine again, and something that looked like it. So what we did is I had the thought of a septic tank. And I had actually seen one on the side of the road, and we built the engine. The engine is really built around a polyethylene septic tank. And so we got a septic tank of the correct that would fit inside an existing cowling. We built this front part of the cowling, and then we did all the fins and the fans and the circle with the infinite loop on it, drawn on top of it. And we basically shipped it all out to LA on the back of a flatbed truck, and then constructed it in a lot. And we made it into two different things. We made it so it could be lifted out of the house in Long Beach, and then we also made it with a negative space down the center of it where we welded it around a big giant pipe that enabled it basically to be a hydraulic ram. Hydraulic? Actually, it was pneumatic, I think. And so what we basically did is we took a pipe and we shoved it in the back end of it, and we were able to put it up at an angle on a crane and basically made a rail gun out of it and blasted it through his bedroom. That was the very last shot of the whole movie. And it was the very last shot of the movie because we fucked it up. And we fucked it up the first time because the rig wouldn't fit in the door. Wasn't me that messed it up. The special effects had an issue. And they built the whole rig when it was hooked up to the forklift that was going to shoot it through the set, about 3 feet too tall to fit through the door that went into the stage. Sometimes it's the easiest stuff that screws you up. And so we were about ready to move it in place. We'd finished everything else in the room that needed to be done when the room was clean. And it was late at night, and we were like, well, we could take it apart, dismantle it, put it back up. It's going to take 3 hours. And we just came back the next day and did it. And it was the only thing we did that day. We did the big effect.
So,
Um,
oh, sorry, I was gonna say, uh, I feel like I gotta ask this because I'm gonna regret if I don't. Like, are you able to say what some of the unmade projects you worked on together were? Because that is something I've been interested in for a while. Like, I've read a lot of
Doctor
the stuff.
Destruction
I never heard that one.
was it? It's a really great script. It was a little bit. It was one of the. I guess we did it right. He was working on it right after the box. Um, God, it might even have been in between. No, I think it was after. It is a big movie, and it's a film that half of it takes place in now or then, probably 2005, 2007. And half of it actually may take place earlier than that. And then half of it takes place inside a virtual reality game.
Really?
And so it was one of those projects that had an enormous, it had to be huge budget wise. We did a little bit of work. We went down to Giant, I think their name was. This was before Avatar came out, the first one,
Oh, is this the motion
and
capture thing he was working on?
yeah,
Okay.
and so we went down. Stephen and Richard and I and probably Sean, his producer McKittrick, um, went down and did a little bit of work. They got us into the spaces where they were filming Avatar and sort of the blocks sets. We were able to play. Richard was able to play around with the camera and be able to take through sort of that virtual camera in the space where he's looking at the completed image. It was really the beginning of the things that became kind of Unreal and the ability to work in a virtual environment. Because you were going to have to do stuff like that for the game within a game. Um, and I mean, there are some really, really beautiful. Richard is a genius at coming up with these really interesting poetic images. One of the kids' father is in one of the towers as it fell, and that plays a role, and it's sort of his version of projecting that child into a moment where he sees his dad right before the towers come down. And it's a really interesting movie. It's also a hard film to finance at that level,
Mhm.
because like a lot of Richard's movies, it's a little out there. In a great way. But speaking of which, Southland Tales, I think I'll have to remember the name of a couple of the others. I've read Bessie. I have it somewhere actually, paper copy of it.
I read like a synopsis of Bessie and it sounded crazy. I think, and I read his
It's
whole
wonderful.
script. Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's a couple others that I've read.
Did you do the one
There
he
was
did
another
that
dark.
was, sorry, I was just gonna say, did you do the one that was about, I think I read he did one about Corpus Christi, Texas.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
great. Yep,
Okay.
Corpus Christi. I also, yep, absolutely. I forgot, totally forgotten about that. Um, yeah, Corpus Christi. I wasn't able to. My art director of the box, Priscilla Elliott, who also was one of the art directors on Southland Tales, ended up being the designer on that for a while when they were in sort of just a. They never really, I think, officially revved up, but so when I look at the three films they did with Richard, the second one is Southland Tales. Southland is the film that I've worked on that had the most change. Darko's the least, the most change from original script that I read to what we ended up making. Um, the original script is a police caper movie in Los Angeles. There is no time travel. There is no monkey balls being shot through a rift in the time warp. There's none of that in the original script. Um, I think Richard really, I don't know, I know somewhat why it changed, because there's an interesting problem with these movies where you end up with these independently financed films and they don't have enough money. I don't know that I've ever done a film that didn't have as much enough money than I did on Southland. Um, it was, but I think at the end it had less. We had less money to do what we did than when we even started. Because what ended up happening is instead of it getting simpler, it got more complicated. And Richard likes to write himself into or out of problems. And he always pushes to get more than we have the money for. And in some ways, it's great because it spurs innovation. Um, it's also the kind of film that, in order to solve some of these financial problems, but that also keeping with the kind of truly madcap nature of the script and the fact that it changes tone every 3 seconds, um, is you throw everything at the wall and you see what sticks. And holy shit, did we throw everything at the wall on that? From, Upu to these insane maps that end up being, um, at that point, a combination of just after hanging Chads, and sort of these ideas of dividing the country up into red and blue. And we basically took these red and blue states. If you look at what those, some of the graphics are, it's us taking a red and blue version of the United States and morphing it in the computer. And so you end up with these. I mean, it's stuff that isn't even, you wouldn't even notice. They're just layers upon layers upon layers. We also did all of the graphics in house. had a very small art department that we worked entirely too much. We built rats that were being out of ground chicken that were being roasted over um, burning things. Had to build that damn ATM to drag through the streets of Los Angeles. Had to come up with how to do. So when I got on that movie, I was doing another thing. Richard had, because he's Richard and he's a persuasive genius. He basically emailed or called Ron Cobb and said, "I got this project. I have this mega zeppelin um, to design." And Ron Cobb was basically retired at that point, but is one of the great illustrators and great sort of science fiction minds of all time. And he drew the Mega Zeppelin. He sketched it out, and then that was sort of the end of his involvement in designing the film. But so I kind of came in, and Richard was like, "Look at this thing that Ron Cobb did." And I was like, "That's fucking amazing." Now, then I had to figure out how it worked and which parts we were going to do where, how we were going to build it. There were scenes inside of it. How do you actually take this basically 2D drawing of from front side top view of an exterior of a mega zeppelin? It's not scaled. None of that is there. And how do you actually make that into something that we then realize as a set? And we spent a long time designing a built environment for the whole finale. Art director or set designer Sam Page and I did, and as we started to design it, we started to work design ideas into an enormous number of different things in the film. The ideas of water, the ideas of perpetual motion, the ideas of being able to harness the power of, the Trier Corporation and liquid fluid karma is harnessing the power of the oceans. And if they're going to do that, and they're going to have Trier Towers in downtown Los Angeles, and Richard really wanted to put them in where the Staples Center is today, or whatever the fuck it's called, crypto arena. That whole area was just basically a blank parking lot. They hadn't even built it yet. And so we designed the Trier Towers, and the Trier Towers in the film, you don't see it very much, actually. We didn't have quite a lot of money to do as many visual extensions as we would today. But they, there's a whole series of waterfalls in that building that were designed, and everything sort of leads back to these ideas of the ocean and power generation, and
Perpetual
also
motion.
perpetual motion, and what a company like Trier would do, as odd as they were, with a public face, with the ideas of companies as using buildings as advertisement. And so when we designed that, and then you, so, and those are things that we design and design and design and design, and then figure out at the end of the day how to put it all together. And we were all over the place. And one of the other things is we had to figure out how to actually control and to create this sort of dystopian Los Angeles in these places that we were shooting that was cheap and fast, easy to dress, and then undress. And one of the things that we did is we ended up sort of focusing on the neo-Marxist. And the whole neo-Marxist is just a hilarious satirical idea anyway. Like Santa Monica is truly filled with neo-Marxists. It's a really good joke if you live in Los Angeles, because it's not. It's filled with a lot of rich people. Left wing, but only in some ways. And so we ended up doing graphics, and we ended up finding this wonderful printer in, I think in East Los Angeles, that would print us on the cheapest paper possible. At bulk, we could do like 50 different posters and get 1,000 of each. I mean, we had literally tons of newsprint posters painted, and we all did them. Took a couple famous photos of Karl Marx, did a bunch of Photoshop on them. I think one of the funniest things that never is commented on is we have Sarah Michelle Gellar go into a nasty bathroom in the which is a stage set in the poop deck on Hermosa Beach, and turn around and sit backwards on a toilet and open a glory hole that has Karl Marx's face.
I remember that.
And it opens it is truly a subversive image for all of the Buffy fans, for her, for everything. And then she gets a memory stick out of, a dongle, as it were, out of the glory hole in the back of the bathroom. It is an outrageous scene. And he just plays it straight, but it's actually one of my favorite sets that I've ever done. It's a little tiny bathroom set, but it's kind of outrageous, and the graphic is great. Um, and so we were able to do a lot of, and then we were able to layer that stuff up. So we were able to take blocks that, because if you go to Hermosa Beach or Manhattan Beach, even then, now it's outrageously upper class, but even then it was. The beach communities in Southern California have this switched relationship between being, they were not where a lot of the money was for a while, at least and then it became that. So we were these things that have been completely, utterly gentrified, beautiful streets. How do we actually get them to feel kind of grimy and on the cusp of weird revolution that and societal collapse that Southland Tales suggests? And we did it through graphics. We posted them everywhere. We slapped stuff up. We did a lot of it. We just did with water and not even glue. So we just pull them down. In the morning we'd go and we'd do 1,000 posters, and then by when we finished shooting that day, they were gone. We took them all down.
I feel like Southland Tales, it has some of like my favorite world building in any movie. I think like, and I was wondering if you and Richard had like a sort of big like world Bible to like describe, because there's so much like there's details upon details. Like even at the beginning when the tanks are going by, there's like a little
Yeah,
like Budweiser logo on one of them,
I think
or
there's a
Bud Light.
Hustler logo too.
Yeah, and like or
The
say
whole idea of Hustlers sponsoring the American military was
had its
wonderful.
time. Yeah.
Oh God, yeah. We wanted to paint the tank pink, but it was supposed to be a pig tank with the Hustler logo, but the we ended up with the tank. Well, we weren't able to paint the tank, but we were able to graphics it up at 4 o'clock in the morning down on Redondo Beach. Um, a single Bible, no. And partially that's because we had images up all over the art department. It was plastered with stuff. It was a little more punk rock than that. We also, if we had time, maybe, but it was so fast that we were going, and the script was changing, and we couldn't afford this, so Richard would rewrite it, and he'd rewrite in something that shoots a monkey through space, and I'd be like, oh fuck, now I got to come up with something that shoots a monkey through space, And so in some ways, it was much more go play as you go, and change stuff as you move through. Zach Fannin was the graphic designer. Priscilla Elliott was the art director, and Scott Dugan was one of the set designers, or I think, I know he was on it, and we all were just anything that could stick to the wall in a good way did. And we did everything. We just kept going. We did the whole stop motion graphic of that, that Digits for Democracy, just that bit. I mean, the SUVs fucking is really funny. And that was one that was completely Richard's from the very beginning. The Saltaire mating with the Saltaire is really brilliant. The Digits for Democracy and the Digits for Democracy poster and that whole graphic, Zach Fannin did, along with a kid whose name I can't remember. But he was a fantastic stop motion guy, or flash motion guy, and he worked inside the art department. And that is a really subversively brilliant little thing. And also, he's had half the cast of Saturday Night Live is in that movie and on it. The number of people that he got that really wanted to play in Richard Kelly ballpark after Darko was enormous. And it was really great. And it is a slide. Also, I mean, I cannot believe that Richard wrote in the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, that he wrote that in as a touch point in the Middle East. Then everything that he does in this shit, Upu is ice. These some of the things that he does, and he did the same thing in Darko, where an engine fell off a plane right when we were about to either release or make the film. He did the box actually had a couple of bits too, but he has a tendency to be just ahead of his time, I think. where he writes stuff that encompasses both kind of where the zeitgeist is going to be in a couple of years in a way that is spectacular.
And like
But
another, sorry, I was gonna say
what?
another really prescient thing. Like there's really there's so many like cool details to cover, but one that I feel also fits modern day well is that the police cars have the Roman like "let them hate so long as they fear" written on the sides of them, like the Latin quote. I feel
Yeah,
like
I think that was me. It was either me or Priscilla. Um, Absolutely. It Yeah, that's a little bit sad that that's part of the one that came true. There's a lot of buried. I'm in that movie. I'm one of the ones holding the
really.
monkey ball. Yeah,
I think like a
there's an interesting thing. There was also, and go ahead and put a Justin Timberlake and Killer's music video right in the middle of the film. It's still one of my favorite bits of any movie I've ever done in the arcade on the Santa Monica Pier. And made with good dancers and April's costumes. Those latex nurses costumes are brilliant for that. Um, but there's also something about there's an interesting thing. I did an interview about Richard's movies at one point, and I was trying to think about one of the with him and Steven actually. And one of the really interesting things about Richard's movies is as despicable as any of the people are. Um, Kitty Farmer, um, even the maybe not the Patrick Swayze pedophile character in Darko, but maybe almost everybody is allowed a moment of redemption,
mhm.
and I think ideas of redemption are huge in his film, and ideas of he writes characters that you really sometimes you really, really, really don't like. And at the same time, he never ever gets to a point where you don't think they're human. And it's really interesting to when you go back and watch his films because um, they make for complicated in the most fantastical worlds and the most hard to follow logical suppositions and that you need to truly understand the films that you need to be able to follow. At the end of the day, they're about the people in them in a way that is remarkable. That he's able to make that juggling act, and they're hard. I think when we finished making Southland Tales, there were three people in the fucking whole world who were able to tell you what that movie was actually doing and was about. I can't do it anymore. I'd have to go back and watch it again, but it was like Richard, Sean, and me. And then by the time there was cut, probably the editor. There, our script supervisor Maxine was driven insane with the logic because there is a logic to it, and it's just very tricky to track. Um, Darko's simple compared to Southland Tales.
I
That
feel like
was a little
Southland
tough.
Tales, I'm able to follow along with it relatively well until the last 30 minutes. Then it gets really crazy. And like
One of the things, yeah,
sorry, I was gonna say I
please.
saw an interview where Wallace Shawn was saying he had no idea what was going on, but that he still really liked it.
I love the fact that's also Wallace Shawn saying that. It's fucking awesome. Um, it I One of the things I really love about that film is it's not meant to be understood intellectually at the end of the day. There's too many tones, there's too many things. There's what did he call the I'm gonna call it Melrose Place, but I don't think that's right. There's the scene where they're all fighting in the mansion, the Mandy Moore scene. I think we did we call it Melrose Place? We might have. It was basically a big soap opera scene. It was clearly written like that. And it was like, no, you did this, no, you did this. And they're fighting across the room and trying to figure out a way to design so we could cover all of that stuff in like whatever the hour and a half we had to film it. Um, but when I watched it projected for the first time, and it didn't get projected very often, we were in Boston making the box when I got to see that projected the first time. And it was a movie that frustrated me for about 25 minutes, half an hour. And I was like, it's all over the place. I knew what we had done and I knew what we had tried to do, but it then I stopped worrying about it because it was so much fun. And it is truly a movie to be experienced. And in some ways, the schizophrenic jumping of tone in scene to scene to scene, um, and I think that also is reinforced by the cast, where you're like, Miranda Richardson, what the fuck, John Lovitz, what is going on here? You know, and as you get farther into it, you, it does make sense. You can go back and figure out what's happening, but the truth is that it's cinema in the best world, where you're you have to just experience what's happening on the screen in that moment. And as soon as I made that shift, and it's hard for me because I designed it, I know every single little bit of it. I know why that door leads to that. I know why we decided not to shoot the other direction in there. Um, when I made that shift, I was like, oh, I fucking love this film. It it truly, and the fact that what we did to make it was just splatter everything. The idea is you didn't work too hard trying to figure out if this was exactly the right thing, because it's truly a maximalist aesthetic. Um, some of his other movies, Darko, not. The Box, not. Those are much more strictly plotted and palette controlled. And, there are things that are outrageous, and there are things that are conundrums, and there are things that are mysterious and that fit slightly up in a way that you wouldn't think they are, but they're not maximalist visually. And that absolutely is.
I remember I went through a
Um,
phase after I first saw it where I would like look up like the reasons for a lot of things, and just like it was everything like had some reason for it being. Like Miranda Richardson had like the entourage of like dwarves, and then when I looked it up, Richard Kelly said like oh, they were there to like crawl into the vents and to be like a Snow White reference. Like there's just something for
it's
everything.
definitely a Snow White reference. Yeah. Um, the translucent translucent gowns they wear for the yoga. There's a ton of really weird shit in that movie that's really great.
There's a scene I think in the Marxist hideout, or I saw this in like some behind the scenes thing where they have like a bowling pins with a bunch of the
Yep,
president's heads. So, like I love stuff like
that
that.
was that was me.
Nice.
Um, there, Richard loved that when we did it. We were, and that was one of those things where, if you're going to be a neo-Marxist in that situation, you're going to be bowling over the ex-president. It was. I have a great mural that we did. The way we did a lot of the neo-Marxist headquarters, we did bring in. We designed them, but then brought in a couple of graffiti artists. We did a lot of it ourselves too, but I'm not a professional. None of us were professional graffiti artists. So we did a lot of the, like, going up the staircase. We did some of that stuff, but the big mural of Marx with the tongue stud. Um, but Karl Marx with the tongue stud with the American flag on it. It's kind of a great subversive image, but it's also one that doesn't make any sense, because the great thing about the neo-Marxist is, and the funny thing about the neo-Marxist is they don't stand for anything. It truly is. It's more anarchy than it is true neo-Marxism. Um, Richard loves I mean, the joke in there, and the satire in there, and the criticism in there is, you know, in Santa Monica, there's this group calling themselves the neo Marxists in the place that is the most expensive place in Los Angeles to live. That's one of the jokes, where it's not the end stage of capital infrastructure then being subverted by the working class. It's a bunch of people who intellectually are calling themselves neo Marxists, who happen to be able to live in Santa Monica, California, is really funny. It's only funny if you kind of know what it is. But so it's the absurdity of all of these different competing um, ideologies and things that are in conflict with each other, all of which are absurd. Um, there's so much in that movie that never ended up being filtered on screen. There is an absolutely outrageous series of albums covers for the spoken word poetry of Amy Poehler and Wood, that we
Prepared.
put up on the wall. There is one of my absolutely favorite piece of graphic design that Zach Fannin did ever, which is a poster for one of their spoken word. It's super disgusting too. Um, for one of their spoken word poetry albums called "Milk and the Dog," which is hilarious. It's raunchy and fucking funny. I have it somewhere.
They have probably one of the best scenes in that movie too, when they're doing like the fake dispute. It's so good.
The fake fight is so absurd. I like that. I gotta watch it again. Now you got me wanting to watch the film again. I'll go back and watch it again.
Actually, a few months ago, Sean William Scott responded to one of my questions in the Q&A. I said, "Would you ever want to do more Southland?" He said, "Yeah, I'm always up for it." Like, and
Oh
I
yeah,
think,
it was great.
yeah, I think Richard said he's like written a lot of stuff. He wrote those graphic novels. He wrote like he said he's written like a sequel set in like the movie script they did. Like he's got all sorts of stuff still in that world.
Would love to do another one. It'd be fucking great. Um, I mean, it's hard to compete with reality, though. I mean, back then, it was before this was sort of commonplace. You know, ice with electric shock gloves coming out.
Hmm.
I mean, it's UFO didn't even go that far. It so it's a little bit like um, I was working on for a minute before timing didn't work out on Idiocracy with Mike Judge back in the day, and I didn't end up designing the film, but I did have a bunch of early conversations with him about it, and that movie also gets equally as we're talking about moving the con tower on aircraft carriers this morning in the news to aesthetically look more like World War II, even though they work better in the place. I mean, we're right at Gatorade watering crops.
Brondo,
We're
yeah.
right there. Yeah.
Like in particular, I think one of the bits that seems the most prescient to me is the Krista Now stuff.
Yeah.
Like all like the
It's
her like talk shows, like talking about all the
golly.
social issues.
Oh my God. Yes. Like we really, really want our porn stars talking about social issues, but Kristen now could take Carolyn Levitt's position as press secretary now that she's stepping away.
Yeah, I
Would
mean,
not, would
before
not, would not be surprising.
like really happy we got to talk Southland Tales. And then I guess I was wondering if you'd be able to talk a bit about your vision for David Goyer's He-Man movie from a few years ago, which I really
Yeah.
like that crazy, colorful world. So I'd be interested in hearing about that.
Uh, Goyer is a genius. I adore him. Uh, I did the Krypton pilot for him.
Nice.
So that's where I got to know him. And then and then I worked for about 6 months on his master's um, version. There's been a lot of them. I think that and full disclosure, I have not seen the one that came out yet. Um, but we basically had, it was a little, I was really sad that it didn't happen. We were really set to go. It was me and a bunch of illustrators for, yeah, about 6 months. Um, 16 weeks, 18 weeks, a long time. But we had designed versions of all the characters, all the major environments. And I think it's truly unfortunate that the reason that it didn't get made was financial. But the truth is that the difference, I've had a couple of movies, one at Fox and one at Sony, that we got all the way to where we were making it. And then they said, no, it needs to hit this price point, and we didn't. And then so it got shut down. And then they made it again a couple years later above that price point, and Masters is one of them. And Unstoppable is the other. And it's a little bit sad. It's why I don't actually want to watch the new one. I probably will though, because I like the world. One of the things that David did that I loved is he found a way to make it. He um, he took at face value what was happening to the characters and the idea of Adam being a human, and what happens when all of a sudden you find out you're this incredibly powerful thing and the savior to this other place you've never been, and how does that work. He took that, and it ends up, what it ends up doing is it ends up being, to me, what that's his version of it ended up being is it ended up being more grounded. in some ways. You could trace back to something that had real human involvement and issue, and also Eternia ended up being in David's mind and in those scripts um, a flip a flip of Earth. It's a mirror shadow world reflection rather than it being, and I think in that way it enabled me to do some really fun, to propose to him some really fun versions of how do you do these kind of mirror world flips, these echo worlds of Earth that have been, and in some ways what we looked at is we said, okay, can we take the idea of a similar starting place and have evolution work in a different way? And that's what we did. And so architecture works in a different way with a different series of initial constraints and initial things that are an initial series of givens. How do you then, how does that go? And we were able to basically be um, really methodical and then fanciful with how do you then take that idea, given all of the givens within the toys and within the universe that Mattel had created, how do you keep with these initial characters and creatures and what they're doing, but really always approach it as this is something that could have existed here with the same series of life forms and the same series of initial givens if they just evolved in a different way. And that was really fun. Um, and then, and the interesting thing when you're doing a project like that, and you're doing a project like that with art department people in Los Angeles or in the United States, is there are only so many people who do that. So I think Fausto ended up working on. I think he did some of the design for the Man at Arms in the movie that actually came out. Fausto DiMartini is a fucking genius in terms of 3D design and modeling of mech and of tech. He's the best. I loved working with him. Constantine is fantastic. Loved working with him. Worked with a whole bunch of different illustrators that also had worked on many other versions of it. It was really fun on that one for me because only sometimes do I get to design the sort of creatures and do I get to be involved in that part of the process. And sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. And sometimes it's a little bit split, like RIPD, half and half, yes and no. Um, in our version of Masters, yes, got to be involved in every part of that. Did sketches for them, but then worked with guys who are way better at me at it. And it was really fun. I loved our merman.
Actually, that's the one
Actually,
picture I saw.
yeah, I think there's some, Beastman does not change very much in terms of any of the versions of him that I saw. Master at Arms is a little bit different depending on which ones you look. We did I thought that the velocipede, I can't remember, the mechanical horse that we had done was fantastically good. We had just gotten to the point where I don't think you're ever going to go very far because you really don't want to in terms of giving people what they want in terms of the He-Man Adam look. We did the David had. I am very sad that no one's gonna be able to see the Skeletor idea that David had. I don't think I can talk about it because who knows what's going to happen with it. But he had a brilliant idea on that that kept with the sort of idea of a Skeletor that people would see and know and like, but took it to a place where we actually hadn't seen it before and was super exciting. And I think that in some ways he thought of it. He thought of his version and take on that as Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, and of he set it up to have a scope and a kind of storytelling structure that echoed those. I mean, you ended up with the Atom started not as He-Man, but as a kid, and as a guy, and as in the same way that you sort of get Luke and Frodo and Bilbo and the Hobbit, you end up with that kind of innocent that is then a larger world is revealed, and they have to then deal with it. And that basic structure, and I don't know if that's the structure that they used in the recent one, but David did a really, yeah, just he's great. He's really smart.
And like,
Um,
would you say like the overall aesthetic, like, could you describe what it looked like? Because He-Man, it's like sometimes it's very colorful, but it's also like it's sci-fi, it's fantasy, it's all these creatures. Like, curious which aspect was most focused on when creating this world.
Definitely, it was a colorful, dramatic world that also was. It was a reinvention of shapes, classical. I would basically say classical shapes from classical architecture used in ways that we've never seen before, and then changing materials for if they had been built. It's a set piece movie, so you're dealing with large kingdoms and Skeletor's castle that it's got to look like a skull. Castle Grayskull is going to be Castle Grayskull on a certain level, but I think that I think we did a really good job with that in making it not just look like a large scale version of. I tried to put architectural rigor into what some of those things looked like. So while it could still look like that, it still was a piece of architecture. It didn't, what we were desperately trying to have it not be is look like a large scale version of a toy. You can you can go back and make it into a toy. But if it looks like the toy expanded, it stops being anything like real. And so what we were trying to keep to maintain the fantastical aspects of those, but design them well for large scale structures. You're not going to have, and not, I think in some ways you take the easy way out by just trying to be as close as you can. You want to go back in and have the same kind of rigor that you do as an architect as you do as building a real building, acknowledging the real materials, seeing, making things as if they would really be built. At the same time, it is a fantasy world, but that fantasy world is a pushing of the theatricality, a pushing of the amazing factor. It's a pushing of things that you really want to see. It's a pushing of the color a little bit, but instead of just like we're going to paint it yellow, it's actually gold. It's things that um, enable us to take that leap into the extra theatrical, extra um, science fiction, fantasy, wish fulfillment of kinds of architecture that you want to see, that you think of as wrapping around these stories, but at the same time, not just doing them for real, trying to have some rigor to them.
Are you able to say what some of
That's a
the
very abstract answer because I'm not actually looking at the things that we actually did. I'm trying to sum up something that I worked on 10 years ago, and it's not quite in my brain anymore.
No, no, I appreciate. Are you able to say what some of the character ideas you had were for some of the cast or like the
Like we had not gone into any casting yet. Um, I think Constantine has posted a bunch of these.
like most of this stuff has been from the Knee
I could come
brothers.
back and relook at them, and then we could continue the interview at some point, but I'd have to look at them again. They're not in my brain anymore.
Oh yeah, no worries. Like I guess the main one I saw posted, I think most of the art has been from the Knee brothers version of it,
Yeah.
but the one I did see was for Merman. I thought I did a really good job translate it. Like it looked basically right out of the cartoon while still looking as like horrifying as you would expect a giant sea monster to look like.
We tried to make the that character actually scary and real and not do so, try to it's really tricky when because they're all mans. So, you're taking something um you're taking something that inherently would not have evolved that way. And you're trying to make it look both scary and not like a rubber suit that somebody wears because there has to be um, we actually looked at a lot of different things, looked at lionfish, looked at other things that had we looked at a bunch of amphibian reference for that. Um, and just tried to actually make sense of justifying what these design choices were on things. There's so many, you can't do better than the weird shit that's in the ocean. I mean, there's so much reference there that we really tried to pull stuff that felt right for the character, but also was based on real things. And so when you went back to it, it started, you could abstract back to the toy, but as you're doing it, you're referencing back into something real. It gives you something to actually hold on to. It gives you a way to have a point of view on it.
Then my last question was just, are there any IPs or directors you would like to work with in the future that you haven't gotten to yet?
Oh God, yeah. I would love to. Where do I start? I want to do a Western. I grew up on them. I find them interesting. I find them very interesting. I'm working on a second outing with Chris McKay right now on a project I really like, who I did Renfield with. I'd love to work with Schwenke again. There's a lot of people. I just finished a project with Dev Patel directing his second film as a writer director from Monkey Man, which I'm very excited about.
Oh wait, I heard
Spent
about that
eight
one.
8 months in India on it. Um, I'd love to work with him again. I I'd love, I have a classic background in theater stuff. I'd love to do a little bit more period work, and I've gotten to do more recently. The project in with Dev is medieval. Um, the sympathizer is Vietnam era. I've gotten to do things. I've gotten to do more. That is, Boots was 1979, 1989. The series for Netflix. So I've gotten to do more that is actually period, and I'd like to do more too. Love to do a Western. I wish I had gotten to interview for Altered Carbon. Really wish I'd gotten to interview for Neuromancer.
Ah, that's cool.
I grew up on 80s cyberpunk science fiction. So I actually think this is, I would hope they make all three of those books. Um, Although I think you'd have a hard time making Mona Lisa Overdrive, the William Gibson books, after The Matrix, which stole a lot of it. Um, at least in theory. Count Zero, his second book, I think is fantastic. I love the most recent ones. I hope he finishes the third one, but the Jackpot series, I would die to design. Um, it's great. Peripheral is the first one, which they made. So I haven't got to sort of throw my. I would love to do a little bit more hard-boiled sci-fi,
Yeah, I think
actually.
I'd really like them to take another crack at Johnny Mnemonic again because I saw Tim
Yeah.
Miller wants to do that story.
Oh, yeah. That it would. I think they should. There's Johnny Mnemonic is good. And it's actually very easy. It's not a hard one to make. It's not out there like the way that for the Sprawl trilogy is, which is much about philosophy and what you get when you create these big AI systems and the ideas of, um, even in the digital world, the ideas of things mating and looking for connection, and a lot of things that Gibson is sort of doing. But um, I hope they go on and do. It would be great to do that again. I think in some ways that's a slam dunk. There's not a lot new to that. I would like to see actually Robert Longo's first cut of Johnny Mnemonic. Um, he talks about that being a very different movie than what ended up being released. Much darker and a little bit more like the book. I think that you're hard pressed to find a better character that, Trinity in some ways in the Matrix movies is Molly,
Mhm.
um, from the Sprawl trilogy. I mean, she's the literary daughter of Molly in a lot of ways. Um, I'd love to do a William Gibson book. I thought, it's interesting. I think it's going to be harder to do them after Thrones. But I love Land Fit for Heroes trilogy, which is the Richard Morgan fantasy trilogy with Ringo Eskjath, Arketh, and that I actually think the Dark Defiles is probably the best. It's the best final book in a fantasy series that has ever been written, It's fucking brilliant. Um, and I think that they're really dark. Um, and I think in like a better version of Game of Thrones is the First Law World that Joe
Oh, I
Abercrombie
got actually
wrote.
just listened to Best Served Cold. Finish that one off.
Yeah, you know what? Bester Cold is great. It although actually I think if you haven't read the first three, because Bester Cold doesn't have Logan in it,
Mhm.
and Logan Nine Fingers is truly one of the great current fantasy characters. He's amazing, and Abercrombie does a very interesting thing where it's actually what Eastwood does in Unforgiven, whereas you wait in Unforgiven till the very, very end to watch Bill Munny fight. And then when he takes the drink of whiskey and he basically goes back to his old self, um, you're a little sad that you wish to see it. And Abercrombie does a very similar thing in the entire First Law series, which is the first one is the blade itself. And there's a character named Logan Nine Fingers, who they call the Bloody Nine. And he makes you wait. You hear about the Bloody Nine, you hear stories about the Bloody Nine. People are worried about the Bloody Nine. They come and you never see the Bloody Nine. And then when you see the Bloody Nine, you wish you hadn't. And it's a very interesting, he plays this game where he's talking about these myths of and he's talking about also he's self-critiquing both his own work and us falling in love with action movies and horror movies and violent movies and sort of the ideas of these. Abercrombie's really rough. He's like George R. Martin without the soap opera overtone of. I think Martin just he doesn't acknowledge. There's not a self-awareness of the killing of all the people that you really want to follow. He
Yeah.
does it, it's sort of for fun. It's sort of let's see if they'll follow me if I kill another one. That's not what Abercrombie is doing at all. And so the world ends up being much darker and much more interesting. Um, so I'd love to do those. I like a lot, you know. What else would I want to do? I'd love to do another sci-fi thing. I would have loved to have done an aliens project.
I'd like to.
It's
I really hope he can reteam with Richard Kelly one day because he claims he always says he has like a ton of stuff in development, which I believe. Like he like
he
cranks
does.
out
Oh
so many
sure.
scripts. Yeah.
I would love to.
All right, that's a solid list. All right. Thanks so much, Alec, for your time. Hopefully we can talk again in the future. It was really fun talking with you. Good luck on your next project. All right, bye.
Absolutely, will do.